Well, it's great to be here, and thanks for coming out on this chilly evening. Fall has arrived after summer just a couple days ago. Leroy and I very much appreciate the opportunity to make this joint presentation regarding sundown towns, which would be a lamentable legacy of Goshen and thousands of communities across the United States the past 100 plus years, especially the first 2/3 of the 20th century, but still persisting today in some places. Thank you, Phil, for inviting us, and we're grateful for your creative work with the Resilience Guild. As the program indicates, I've titled the PowerPoint presentation, Goshen, Indiana, from Sundown Town in 20th century to Resolution in 21st century. And I put the word resolution in quotes because even though the Goshen City Council took a very significant step 3.5 years ago to unanimously pass a resolution acknowledging this aspect of Goshen's history, we as a community and as individuals are still a work in progress as we seek resolution regarding racial issues. By no means have we arrived. There's a lot that could be said about Sundown Town, so I decided to write out most of my comments in order to focus on the most pertinent. After an interview, Leroy and I look forward to questions, discussion, and your own stories that you might share with us a bit later. I would note that I'm indebted to my high school classmate, Carol Helmuth Hondrick, for about a dozen of the following slides. A decade ago, she had taken Damascus Road anti-racism training, read Jim Lowen's book that we're going to see here in a moment, and she put together her own PowerPoint. I first heard about Dr. Lowen's 2005 book on sundown towns, including Goshen, approximately 8 years ago when Annette Roe-Bergstresser told us about it at the church that she and I attend, Faith Mennonite. I borrowed the book from Annette for about a week, as I recall. And by the way, you might detect a pattern here. First Carol Hondrick's pivotal role, now Annette's. Indeed, at least a half dozen different women played significant roles in this effort the past few years. Okay, who wouldn't want to visit a sundown town? You know, what a great place to hang out, right? That tranquil sounding expression, however, cloaked a nationwide chamber of horrors for African Americans during most of the 20th century. Dr. Lowen defines a sundown town as any organized jurisdiction that for decades kept African Americans or other groups from living in it. I would add, or even staying overnight in it. Call it ethnic cleansing American style. Also affected were Jews, Chinese Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, but African Americans bore the brunt of the practice for at least 2/3 of the 20th century. The civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s was instrumental in finally starting to turn the tide and erode the power that most such towns had over people of color. But vestiges of this reality still linger today in pockets of intolerance across the United States. James W. Lowen is a Harvard-trained sociologist and retired professor. Now in his 70s, he continues to speak and write. In addition to his book, Dr. Lowen has an extensive website in which he lists nearly 10,000 towns, cities, suburbs, and even counties throughout the U.S. as surely, probable, or possible with that designation, including more than 250 in Indiana. And about 400 in Illinois, for example, where he grew up. You simply Google list of sundown towns and a map of the 48 contiguous states comes up. Out of curiosity, I began checking a number of states like Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Kansas, and Oregon. As a Mennonite myself, found at least a dozen so-called Mennonite communities that Lowen has on his list. So Goshen is not unique by any means, but I focused on Goshen because it has been my home for more than 40 of the last 50 years, and it's the community I know best. I show this slide primarily because it has Marian Anderson pictured. That's how all this got started for me just over 5 years ago. Briefly, this is what happened. In early September 2013, the Goshen News published a letter I wrote in which I said, among other things, that Marian Anderson, an internationally renowned African-American singer, quote, needed to stay at the Hotel Elkhart, unquote, after performing at Goshen College in 1958 because of the, quote, Sundown law tradition of Goshen. That was in my letter to the Goshen News. Within 24 hours, 2 retired GC faculty members, first the late Harold Bauman and then Irvin Beck, set me straight, clarifying that in the late 50s, all of the college's honored guests in its lecture music series, regardless of race or ethnicity, stayed at the Hotel Elkhart because it was the best in the area. I decided to write another letter to the Goshen News acknowledging my historical error, but also to say a bit more about why I and many others, including Dr. Lowen in his book, made this mistake about Ms. Anderson in light of Goshen's bigoted backstory. That 300-word letter soon morphed into 1,000 words, and eventually 4,300 words, and more about that later. The fact that Goshen systematically excluded African Americans for much of the 20th century is not in question. My research confirms this fact, as does the research of many others, including Dr. Lowen, Ruth Eichste and Les Zook, Goshen College students in 51 and 81 respectively, Steve Nolt, a former GC history prof, Joe Springer, curator of the Mennonite Historical Library at GC, Mike Puro, mayor of Goshen from 88 to 97, and a 2012 GC class called Reporting for the Public Good. So how did these jurisdictions become sundown towns? Signage at the city limits was one way, as shown here. But I could find no evidence that this was ever the case for Goshen. Former mayors Mike Puro and Alan Kaufman told me the methods used in the Maple City for the first 2/3 of the 20th century were largely social and cultural. And I've heard from many African Americans and others that Goshen long had a reputation for being hostile to people of color. An African American pastor, Robert Hunt of Elkhart, now in his 70s, told me his parents always told him, "Don't let the dark catch you in Goshen." The sundown town phenomenon developed after the Civil War Reconstruction in the late 1800s, as many African Americans were leaving the decimated South to find work and a new beginning. Many settled in the big cities of the North, but they often had less success finding homes and a sense of welcome in smaller municipalities. That's when the children and grandchildren of Northern Civil War veterans who had fought to end slavery found numerous ways to exclude African Americans from their communities. There's some 19th century background for Elkhart County and Goshen. The first African Americans to live in Elkhart County, which was established in 1830, Goshen in 1831, were Robert Cypress and an unnamed female in the 1830s, according to the 1840 U.S. Census. The 1860 census reveals no fewer than 11 black and mulatto persons living in Goshen. In light of Goshen's sundown town history, some are surprised to learn that Elkhart County, and especially Goshen, was an abolitionist stronghold in the late 1830s and early to mid-1840s. The editors of both Goshen newspapers, Charles Murray and E.W.H. Ellis, were abolitionists. Murray personally sheltered runaway slaves at his property in Jefferson Township, just north of Goshen. A key route of the Underground Railroad came through Goshen in the 1840s, through Fort Wayne, up through Bristol and into Michigan, from really the Quaker community in Richmond and then another Quaker community up in central Michigan. Indeed, Elkhart and LaGrange County were two of only four of Indiana's 91 counties at the time to vote against an 1851 law that tried to make Indiana a sundown state. The 1851 referendum vote statewide was 84% to keep Negroes from settling in Indiana. But in Elkhart County, only 38% supported the new exclusionary law. So it's both ironic and disturbing that about 60 years later, Goshen was well on its way to becoming one of the most notorious sundown towns in Indiana. In 1890, there were 21 Negroes in Goshen, according to the census. By 1910, 20 years later, that number had dropped to 2, where it remained in single digits into the 1940s. The number rose to 11 in 1950. So in an amazing coincidence, it took 90 years for Goshen to come full circle. 11 African-American residents once again. Dr. Lone has told me personally that of all of Indiana's sundown towns, he has more information about Goshen than any other city besides Martinsville, which is between Indy and Bloomington. Regarding this slide, use your imagination as to why many different communities would have a black donkey painted on rocks and signs at the city limits. In his book, Dr. Lowen says this donkey was photographed in Tennessee in 2003. This symbol relates to exclusion methods by sundown towns, which included violence, threats of violence, racist verbal harassment by local police and others, profiling and arrest by police, restrictive property deeds, social ostracism, especially from schools, churches, and community clubs, refusal of service in commercial establishments such as hotels, motels, and restaurants, ordinances, which also was not Goshen's method of exclusion. Mike Pura went back all the way to the 1830s to check all the ordinances, and he never found anything, even in the 1890s, early 1900s, to his surprise. And finally, signage at city limits. 5 years ago, when I was talking about all this to the Kenyan-born manager of a Goshen eatery on College Avenue, another man at the counter spoke up. Now of Mishawaka, he said he grew up in Kokomo and recalled traveling as a 10-year-old with his father south through Elwood, just northeast of Indy, in the early 60s. At the city limits was a sign that clearly barred Negroes. He asked his dad about it, and the two then had quite a conversation about race. More later on restrictive covenants Goshen style, but here's a 1919 example from Salt Lake City by land merchant Kimball and Richards. So they weren't too subtle about it. In the 1901 newspaper headlines from Evansville, Indiana, note the strident editorial tone on the right there. That's 1901, and this wasn't the editorial page. The three signs above and the one below leave little to the imagination. We want this N-word moved. We intend to keep this neighborhood white. Notice they couldn't spell two. I noticed that as a copy editor. Out with NAACP. And below, Father Groppe rest in hell. A white Catholic priest was urging fair housing in Milwaukee in the late 60s. A Goshen version of the top photo occurred in the early 1950s. A son of Rollin Roth, Goshen's Republican mayor in the late 40s and early 50s, called me to say that when his dad, after some of my stuff was in the Goshen News, he called to say when his dad was mayor, a Negro family moved to Goshen. He said his father took all kinds of grief about it. But he recalled his dad telling his critics, it's a free country, reminding the callers that in 1948, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that restrictive housing covenants were, quote, unenforceable, unquote. I asked Mr. Roth what happened to the family. Oh, they didn't last long, he said. The neighbors saw to that, harassing the newcomers so unmercifully that the family soon moved out of the Maple City. Tulsa, Oklahoma, May 31 and June 1, 1921. On June 1st, whites tried to make Tulsa a sundown town. This is from Dr. Lowen's book. Quote, he said, as part of the attack, deputized white men raided a munitions dump, commandeered 5 airplanes, and dropped dynamite and incendiary firebombs onto the black community. Like efforts to expel blacks from other large cities, the Tulsa mob failed. The job was simply too large, unquote. From 39 to 300 African Americans died, along with about 10 whites, in the racially motivated attack on Black Wall Street, likely the wealthiest black community in the United States at the time. An estimated 10,000 African Americans were left homeless by raging fires that destroyed 35 city blocks. Many of the city's black-owned businesses also were destroyed. Lowen says this was the first time there was aerial bombardment of the continental United States. The second time was 9/11. Most cities and towns in the South already had large populations of African Americans, separate and unequal, but still coexisting in the same community. Early in the 20th century, the racism of the Midwest, and even points farther north, began manifesting itself. Milo, Maine is about as far north as you can get. This daylight KKK parade was in 1923. Dr. Lowen says Milo listed its first African American household in the 2000 U.S. Census. But Klan activity in Indiana also was also very prominent, especially in the 1920s, but throughout the entire 20th century. Goshen had a Klan rally at the courthouse as recently as 1996. Some of you probably remember that. My second son, Jason of Elkhart, discovered the following startling facts. In 1925, guess what percentage of the native-born white males of Elkhart County were members of the Klan? Any guesses? How many? Not that many. Thank goodness. 26%, one fourth of all white males were members of the Klan. And he found out also that 2/3 of the national Klan lecturers were Protestant ministers. That was 1925. In Indiana, and that percentage was Elkhart County, 26% in Elkhart County of the males. I received this two-sided flyer after having a letter to the editor of the Elkhart Truth in the early 70s about a diversity issue. The Klansman's prayer contains this line, Father, Negroes have fallen for this communist mess and put America in a state of unrest. Does this remind anyone of 1930s Nazi propaganda about the Jews? When all else fails, scapegoat a group. And now on the left, according to the KKK, the Bible says this about race in Acts 17:26. From one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live. That was probably their favorite part of the verse. This Klan flyer came to me from Greenwood, Indiana, with a stamp for Osceola, Indiana on it. Here's a letter I had in the Elkhart Truth, October of 72. This is another letter, a year after I had started working at Mennonite Board of Missions in Elkhart and covering, among other things, the Minority Ministries Council. When a half dozen of us, a mixed racial group, went to Shakey's Pizza Parlor for lunch one day, a highly racist film very quickly came on the screen overhead. I was upset. I protested to the manager, then wrote a letter about it. Yeah, I got some fan mail, again, this time from the National Socialist Party of America out of Chicago, complete with swastika. Slide 6 was an example of print-related racism. Now we're at slide 12. Here's another example, and now we're back in Goshen. The page here in front of you is from an undated publication called Goshen, which was a PR piece, which was produced by the city utility and the mayor's office in the mid-30s, probably 36 or 37. Clell Firestone was mayor at the time. In the public health and safety section of the booklet are these words, quote, contributing in large measure to the absence of crime is the character of the population of Goshen. Nationalities are 97.5% native-born white, 2.5% foreign-born white. There is no Negro population. They were very close to right, because I think in 1930 there were 2 on the census. 1940 it was up to 6. This booklet served as a template for mayor's office publicity about Goshen for the next 15 years through 1951, then for the newly minted Chamber of Commerce in 1953. The racist language was finally removed from the chamber material, from publicity materials in, again, guess what year? When did they finally take the language out? Any ideas? 1978. 1978, 15 years after Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. So 79. It was still in 78. 79, I looked and it wasn't there finally. For the final 15 years that they had this language, 64 to 78, the no Negro population wording had been changed to 0.5% non-white. My research evolved throughout the fall of 2013. At one point, I got a call from Joe Springer of the Mennonite Historical Library at GC. Joe was researching the origins in the late 20s of the Redskins name for Goshen sports teams. He said he also had seen something at the Goshen Public Library about a minstrel show in Goshen in '56. He wondered if I was interested, and I said I was. I went to the library a day or two later and found this photograph. It was from a 1990 Goshen News column called Looking Back to 1956, when the 12th annual, you can't see it very well on the left there, but got cut off there, but the 12th annual Goshen Minstrel Show took place. You might be able to see that nearly half the people of all ages in this photo are in blackface. The event took place on the stage of Goshen High School. This was a community event. This was not just high school students. You can also see there's a long caption listing all 1956 participants, around 75 total. As I read through the names, and Joe hadn't pointed this out, I was amazed to read the following. Accordion solos by Alan, right in the middle there, by Alan Kaufman, Catherine Detweiler, and Charles Amadea Jr. I soon called the mayor of Goshen, who was supportive of my research. I asked him if that was he in 1956. Alan ruefully said yes, he was 7 at the time. Quote, I was so young, he told me, whenever there was a musical program, my mom would trot me out to play the accordion, which I had learned to play at age 5. As a child, it never occurred to me that we were making fun of a race of people, unquote. Alan pointed out that he was not in blackface, but there he is in the center. You see the guy in the tie. Alan is just to the right of the guy in the tie in the center. An internet definition of minstrel shows reads as follows. Minstrel shows lampoon black people as dim-witted, lazy, buffoonish, superstitious, happy-go-lucky, and musical. The minstrel show began in the early 1830s and often starred a white man in blackface calling himself Jim Crow. and survived as professional entertainment until about 1910. Amateur performances continued well into the 1960s in high schools like Goshen and in local theaters. Goshen community was not alone, of course, in producing these shows. I found in a 1953 Goshen news item about a Napanee minstrel show. The mayor was listed as giving the welcome and the introduction. And it wasn't just Goshen and Napanee in this area. E2 Goshen College. In another interesting find, Joe Springer sent me this from 1935, a program by the Adelphians, one of the literary societies at GC. Joe found these pages on a Southern-themed soiree that evoked some of the stereotypes of the minstrel show of that era, including solos by Atlee Beachy, a future church leader in peace and justice, Harold Buzzard, blind Elkhart businessman who lived at Greencroft in the 70s. I soon called the late Evelyn Kreider at Greencroft, who in 35 was a student at the college. She didn't remember that particular program, but she said something like, "We were very insulated in those days. We had a lot to learn." The first African-American student at GC was Juanita Lark, a senior in the fall of 1942. She had spent her junior year at Heston College in Kansas. The Welcome Center at Goshen College was recently named after her. Willis Johnson was the first African-American student at Eastern Mennonite College, now University, in Virginia in 1948. New president John R. Moomaw from Ohio angered some members of the EMC Board of Overseers in 48 when he personally broke the college's color barrier by inviting Johnson, a Harrisonburg resident, to enroll. Then 14 years later, a young Floridian named Leroy Berry also enrolled at EMC. The second or third black student at GC in 45 was Pennsylvania's Florence Baynard, mother of Daniel Grimes, Goshen's first black city council member, serving from 2000 to 2007. He said his mother wanted to go to EMC, but a Pennsylvania bishop said, "Don't even bother trying, but Goshen might take you." Goshen is now 3 to 4% African American, about 1,000 residents, and at least 35% Latino, about 12,000 residents. Jose Ortiz was Goshen's first Latino elected official of any office. He began serving on the Goshen School Board in 2015. Former mayors Puro and Kaufman both told me about Goshen's history of restrictive property deeds and covenants. Puro said Jews also were excluded in some of them. Here's one from the Fiddler edition in 1946. Number 5, I have the arrow there, says, "No person of any race other than the white race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, though domestic servants were allowed." Similar language appeared for the Carter Road and Martin Manor subdivisions just south of Goshen College. Here we see that Cripe title, now Stewart title, was crossing out the offensive language by the early to mid-1980s, partly to ward off possible legal action. But my friend Jim Ingold, a former president there, said it's very difficult legally to get such language changed so it gets crossed out or ignored. I would note, however, that during the same era, Mother's Day 1982, an interracial Goshen couple, black husband, white wife, not Leroy and Beth, living just east of downtown Goshen, had their car doused with gasoline and torched one night. The car, which was parked close to their house, was a total loss. If a neighbor walking her dog late at night hadn't seen what was happening and alerted them, called the fire department, their house might have burned down. 1982. My research also found stirrings of change in Goshen in the 50s and 60s. This is page 1 of a 7-page document that came out of an April 1955 conference at GC, an event that led to a church-wide statement in August of 55 titled "The Way of Christian Love in Race Relations." Guy Hirschberger, a GC sociology prof, also had a church-wide role, and more than a half dozen African Americans and Africans joined 20 whites at the April conference. The church-wide efforts of the mid-50s, however, didn't do much filtering down to most grassroots Mennonite churches. An exception from the late 50s to the mid-60s and probably beyond was 8th Street Mennonite Church. Already in the late 50s, 8th Street was taking leadership in race relations in Goshen, as evidenced by multiple Goshen News articles on cross-cultural events and discussions about racial issues at the church during that era. Pastor at 8th Street starting in 63 was J. Herbert Fretz. Some of you probably know him. Recently passed away, I believe. Am I right? Yeah, okay, a few years ago. Also he was a member of the Ecumenical Goshen Ministerial Association. In 1964, the GMA adopted a civil rights statement publicly calling on Goshen to open itself to housing and residence by members of all races. The 8th Street newsletter ran the entire text of the GMA statement on page 1, May 6 of 64 newsletter. A portion of the statement reads as follows. I don't know if you can read it. I'll just highlight what stood out to me. Why does the GMA feel that our community has a problem in race relations when people on all sides say, we have no problem because we have no Negroes? The problem lies in the fears which characterize many people of Goshen. Along with other problems in human relations, for example, integrating white immigrants from southern states into our community, these fears cry out, expressing the needs of Goshen. On the basis of the historic American guarantees of equal opportunity, the fears are regrettable. But on the basis of our Christian faith, they represent a tragedy. Another sign of progress was the stands taken by young Mennonite leaders like J. Lawrence Burkholder and Victor Stoltzfus. Both men in the mid-60s went south and took part in civil rights actions, and both later became president of Goshen College. This is page 1 of a memorial service, April 9, 1968, for Dr. King at Harvard Divinity School, where Burkholder taught at the time. J. Lawrence gave the final eulogy. In it, he said, quote, and I got this information from J. Lawrence's daughter, Myrna, who's here this evening. Thank you for coming. Quote, like the prophets who reminded Israel of its covenant, Dr. King reminded us of the ideals upon which this democracy was founded: equal opportunity for all, freedom, justice, and brotherhood. There we go. Amid all this necessary heaviness, a brief interlude. Yes, that was yours truly, lower photo in glasses. In the spring of '69, I was a first-year student at Goshen College, was asked to cover a black youth rally for Gospel Herald, the church-wide Mennonite publication. At upper right is a young gentleman named Leroy Berry, who a few months later would start a 40-year career teaching political science and history at GC. That may have been the first time that we met. I think it was. So what can we do in the face of systemic and individual racism we still encounter today? Here are some ideas from Carol Hondrick and me. Speak up and challenge it. Write letters to editors. Teach children about diversity issues. Recognize that humor can sometimes be a cover for racist attitudes. Cultivate cross-cultural friendships. Financially support interracial causes. Vote on the side of justice. Celebrate diversity in Goshen and beyond. And this takes us back to Goshen once again. Someone who did speak up was John Stith, Goshen's straight-talking postmaster for about 15 years from the late 70s to the early 90s. This is an article I did for the Elkhart Truth in January 87, less than a year after I started working there, in connection with a Dr. King Day speech that Stith gave at the Goshen Noon Kiwanis Club. And he was a member of that club, along with Alan Kaufman and many others. I thought Stith showed remarkable courage that day in front of an all-white audience. He described Goshen as a clannish town. In my story, I gave him the benefit of the doubt and spelled clannish with a C and not with a K. He said, Goshen has never accepted outsiders. 40 years ago, if you had told me I'd be this town's postmaster, I never would have believed it. As a high school student in South Bend in the late 30s, early 40s, young Stith had competed in the Goshen relays. Quote, whether you won or lost, he said, smiling and shaking his head, you had to get out of town quick. Remedies. This is from Carol Hondrick. In 2013, when I started the Sundown Town project, I didn't realize I was implementing Carol's first point. But increasingly, I felt a calling to research and write, and as a Goshen resident, but also as part of my Christian walk. Telling this story hasn't been fun because there's a lot of difficult and painful material here, but I've tried to get the stories right. And I've been inspired in my effort by Howard Thurman, a 20th century African-American theologian, educator, and civil rights leader. He said, quote, don't ask yourself what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, then go and do that, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. In my Marian Anderson clarification in September of 2013, I soon had enough material that the Goshen News editor agreed to run this 1,000-word piece on September 22, 2013. My sister Rhoda Keener, then director of Mennonite Women USA and still head of the Sister Care Network, saw what I had done for the news and said a lot of Mennonites across the country, not just Goshenites, also needed to know about and face these issues. She recommended Mennonite World Review. In late September, I contacted editor Paul Schrag about it, and we negotiated for 2 months. I already had a lot of copy. In late November, he agreed to run it in connection with Dr. King Day 2014. By the time I finally sent Schrag my evolving version in early January, it had grown to 4,800 words. He trimmed it to about 4,300. I thought he did a wonderful job graphically as well in presenting such a long piece. The Associated Church Press agreed, giving MWR an award a year later for in-depth coverage. After Laura Coyne, a progressive kindred spirit in Goshen, saw the MWR version, she suggested that it be posted on the Goshen Commons website. They're also comprised about 4,300 words, but with more of a Goshen emphasis, less about Mennonites. Another woman, Sarah Hirschberger Mast of our church, read what I had written and asked, now that we know all this, what is Goshen going to do about it? I replied, good question, Sarah. And the next day I contacted Mayor Kaufman, which started Goshen's 14-month Sundown Town resolution process. Toward the end of his 2005 book, Dr. Lowen has a 42-page chapter titled Sundown Towns Today. Yes, today. But it's also true that change can happen, as Bluffton, Indiana, south of Fort Wayne, can attest. Goshen, too, is changing. A couple of cases in point. The summer of 1996, as noted, a small faction of the KKK exercised its constitutional right to free speech by getting permission for, then conducting, a rally on the steps of the Elkhart County Courthouse in downtown Goshen. Former Police Chief Mike Kettlebar recalled a total of about 150 people on both sides of the divide coming to the courthouse as 30 to 40 police officers kept them apart. Meanwhile, though, about 1,000 people, including yours truly, voted with our feet, and attended Goshen's first annual Diversity Day celebration at Shanklin Park, a mile south. I covered the event for The Truth, particularly with the leadership of Srikala Rajagopalan. Close. Rajagopalan. Okay, now I got it. I'm glad to have you here, Srikala. Originally from India, Diversity Day was subsequently celebrated annually for 15 years. And 6 years before Bluffton's mayor put up his signs, Goshen was doing the same in 2000. In the center is former Mayor Alan Kaufman, the same guy who played his accordion at the Goshen Minstrel Show in '56. Next to Alan is Carl Weaver, a teacher at Goshen High School, bioethics, part of which tackled diversity in the spring of '99. Far right is Matt Scott, a Goshen sign maker, who at no cost prepared the 4 signs that graced Goshen's 4 major entryways for about a decade until the colors faded and the signs came down. But finally at left is Tim Shenk, our oldest son. Glad Vera's back here. And Tim is now of Ithaca, New York. But he was a class member who led a student group that went to the Goshen Human Relations Commission and the Goshen City Council to get permission to place the signs. He also conceived and executed the artwork on the sign, which shows 5 buckets pouring 5 colors of paint onto Goshen structures. I was proud of Tim then, and I'm proud of him now. Currently, he's director of the Committee on U.S. Latin American Relations out of Cornell. As mentioned earlier, another sign of progress for Goshen occurred 3.5 years ago, March 17, 2015, when the Goshen City Council voted 6-0 to acknowledge the racially exclusionary past of Goshen as a sundown town. Most of you might have picked this up as you came in. The resolution shown here was the culmination of almost 5 months of work by a lot of people, Democrats and Republicans and independents, who felt this would be an important step for Goshen to take. What you see here is, and what you have in your hand, is the 31st draft of the resolution, which Leroy and I first presented to the Community Relations Commission, CRC, November 11 of 2014, about 4 or 5 months earlier. Why 31 drafts? Because nearly a dozen different people from November to March helped draft this document, which truly became a nonpartisan community effort. Providing particularly helpful input were Republican council members Brett Weddle and Ed Allersmeyer II, along with Goshen College's Gilberto Pettis Jr. When Leroy and I addressed the CRC, I thought he powerfully set the stage for community discussion about this issue. Here are 2 paragraphs from his 1.5-page statement. Leroy has agreed to read what he stated that night. I figure it makes more sense. Do you have it with you right there? Here we go. Stan, did you see it?
Do you mean the quote? Yeah. It's a quotation here from the... Closer? There you go. All right. It's a quotation from what I presented to the committee. It says, the historical record is clear. Individual freedom, in dark print, is preeminent among American values. But that same historical record also shows that despite the deep-seated belief in and commitment to individual freedom, Goshen, Indiana, along with many other towns and jurisdictions in the United States, denied people of color the right to exercise their individual freedom. They denied it by letting people of color know, in a variety of ways, that they were not free to come and go at any time that they chose, even if they respected the rights of others. That people of color, unlike white people, had to leave before sundown. Perhaps the city of Goshen, in its own way, can be exemplary by formally stating to the world that its, quote, sundown town past was in violation of the most cherished value, the belief in the integrity and freedom, again in dark print of the individual. That's quote.
Thank you, Leroy. In the last couple of weeks before the council vote, a number of people raised questions about other groups, in addition to African Americans, being discriminated against throughout Goshen's history, including Jews, Dutch celery pickers, the Amish, Appalachian whites, Ukrainians, Russians, and of course, Latinos. In my remarks to the city council, I said it had indeed happened in various ways in Goshen, but I said the African American experience for most of the 20th century in this community was unique in three respects: its intensity, its duration, 70 to 80 years, and the fact that it was formalized in writing by city leadership, mayor's office, chamber of commerce, subdivision developers, from at least 1937 to 1978. On March 17, I also said, soon after Nelson Mandela was elected in 1994 as the first black president of South Africa, he and Archbishop Desmond Tutu initiated a truth and reconciliation process because, as they said, truth-telling precedes healing and reconciliation. I think we're trying to do something similar in Goshen with this resolution. In my view, the key portion of the resolution is actually on page 2. It's the final 9 words. It happened, it was wrong, it's a new day. That the City Council passed this resolution is in some measure historic. According to Dr. Lowen, several other Sundown towns have gone on record in facing their past, but these steps were taken by, I call them 3 M's, mayors, museums, and media. Lowen tells me that Goshen still may be the first sundown town in the U.S. to have a duly elected council comprising members of both political parties to make such a statement. I'd like to publicly commend the Goshen News for its excellent coverage of the resolution process from mid-November to mid-March. 9 days after Leroy and I went to the CRC, we also took the idea to the Goshen Ministerial Association. Within 2 weeks, the GMA reported its unanimous endorsement of the resolution. I'd like to thank Julie Gauchi, the councilwoman for my district, for her wise counsel in early fall 2014 that Leroy and I could proceed simultaneously with the CRC, and glad to have Darren here from the CRC and also the GMA. And so we did. We presented 9 days apart. The Goshen News covered the GMA decision as well as the CRC's discussion of the issue in 5 consecutive meetings from November to March. Leroy and I opted out. We chose to trust the process, so we didn't attend after that first meeting. Credit also goes to CRC Chair Nate Mateer-Rempel, who shepherded the resolution through those 5 at times intense sessions till March 10. The body voted 7-0 to recommend to the City Council that it consider the resolution. The News covered this process every step of the way, and in December 2015 listed the resolution passage of one of Goshen's top 5 stories of the year. A day or two after the first Goshen News story by Roger Schneider in mid-November 2014 on the resolution idea, regarding which someone had sent an internet link to Dr. Lowen at his home in Washington, he emailed me and said he'd like to come to Goshen to encourage our process further. So we made arrangements for him to come to Elkhart County. A number of us worked at it. I won't say all the names here, in the interest of time. Here, Dr. Lowen is pictured front and center at the St. James AME Church in Elkhart the evening of March 1, along with a number of us involved in the planning and the programs. Our second son, Jason, is right center in the back as head of the People's History of the Elkhart Group, and he made comments from Elkhart's perspective that evening. Lowen spoke in 3 public settings, 4 private ones over 1.5 day period. His last Elkhart County appearance was Monday, March 2 at College Mennonite. There, Mayor Kaufman made a 10-minute speech in the midst of his speech in support of the resolution process, which was Allen's first public statement about it since I had raised the idea with him more than a year earlier. A personal highlight for me that evening was the spontaneous embrace that Leroy gave Alan as the mayor stepped off the platform. That's on page, that's attached to your resolution, so I won't read this so that we can get to the next portion here. But Dr. Lowen took note and put something on his website. Leroy and I were elated by the council vote in March 2015 and grateful to all members of the GMA, CRC, and City Council, as well as Mayor Kaufman, who gave us and the resolution a hearing. Richard Aguirre of Goshen College took this photo about 20 minutes after the vote by the council. Leroy and I have been friends since the fall of '71 when we worked on a print project together. In the summer of '71, Leroy had been best man at my older brother Dave's wedding in Morton, Illinois, another Sundown town. Dave and Leroy had become friends while working in Mennonite Voluntary Service in Cleveland, Ohio in 1966. Do I have the year right? 66 or 67? 67, okay. You also met a young woman named Beth Hostetler, too, I think, in Cleveland, right? Okay. As noted earlier, Leroy became professor at GC in '69. In '85, he graduated from law school. He's been an attorney in Elkhart and Goshen ever since. Also, as noted, I was a reporter for the Elkhart Truth for 13 years. During that time, I got to know John Stith, Goshen's postmaster, member of Goshen Noon Kiwanis, Maple Crest Country Club, and other Goshen organizations. He died about 15 years ago. In my view, John Stith and Leroy Berry did more in the late 20th century and early 21st century to help break down the walls of prejudice and gradually help Goshen be transformed from a sundown town into the forward-looking community it largely is today. Leroy's quiet dignity, cordial professionalism, and insightful observations have blessed and inspired me and others for a long time. Pleased he's here this evening. I closed both of the longer pieces I wrote with quotes from former GC history prof Steve Nolt and from Leroy. I'll close the same way this evening. First, Steve. As Steve Nolt said, communities that fail to acknowledge their racial past may have a harder time moving forward in a positive way. It's not like we need to dwell on this and say the community is forever marked by it. But the other extreme would be to just not acknowledge it at all, which could blind us to ways that prejudice might continue. And Leroy said, we need to tell these stories. It's easier to have a false understanding of our community than it is to deal with ambiguities. This process helps to foster healthy humility for us all. Thank you, Leroy, and thank you all.